A blizzard tore across the Montana mountains, swallowing the narrow trail to the high ridge. Through the whiteout, a lone woman rode hard on horseback, the wind clawing at her coat. Every hoofbeat was a gamble with death. She would not turn back. The storm thickened until she could barely see the ground, yet she kept calling out, her voice ripped away by the gale. She found him half buried in the snow, legs shattered, breath fading. With every ounce of strength she dragged him onto the horse and turned toward the cabin. When the cabin lights flickered into view, 3 figures waited in the shelter of the lean-to. The leader stepped forward, tall, cold-eyed, a thin sneer on his lips, and a rifle resting easy in his hands. She reined the horse to a stop, standing between the armed men and the unconscious rider she had just saved. She held her ground. The wind still howled, but something else was about to explode right there in the snow. The mountain took 5 of them. Not with wolves. Not with cold. Not really, though the cold got blamed for everything up here. It took them the way silence takes people. Slow. Then all at once. Ezekiel Wren stopped counting the days after the 5th one left. He started counting something else instead. Miles between him and the next living soul. Cords of wood stacked against a wall that never seemed tall enough. Mornings he woke up and reached for a voice that wasn't there and never had been. Not really. Not for longer than a week. 5 brides. 5 letters answered. 5 women who rode up that pass with their trunks and their hope and their carefully practiced smiles. And 5 who rode back down it wearing something else on their faces. Relief, mostly. He remembered that part clearest. Not the crying. The relief. Because that was the part that stayed with a man. The first one lasted 3 days. Her name was Odette Vance, and unlike the 4 who came after her, he never once forgot it. Not the name, not the sound of it, not the particular way she'd said his own name back to him. That first evening, careful, like she was still deciding whether to trust it. She stood in his doorway, with her carpet bag clutched to her chest like a shield, and she looked past him at the mountains, and she started to cry. Before he'd even said hello. Just stood there, crying, like the land itself had wronged her, before she'd even set foot on it. I can't, she said. 2 words. That was all she gave him. 2 words and a lifetime of silence after. He paid her fare back to Helena, and didn't ask for it back. The second one made it a week. Longer, but not by much. She tried. He'd give her that much. Tried to cook on his stove, tried to scrub floors that didn't want scrubbing, tried to smile, through a supper eaten in a silence, so thick you could have cut it, and served it on the plate beside the beans. Then the wind came up one night, and rattled the shutters like something trying to get in, and she sat straight up in bed, and said, out loud, to no one, I want to go home. He heard her through the wall. He heard everything through these walls. That was the trouble, with a cabin this small, this far from everything. It held sound the way a held breath holds panic. Tight, waiting to break. She left on a Tuesday. Took the mule. Didn't look back. Not even once. Not even at the door. The 3rd. The 4th. The 5th. They blurred in his memory the way faces blur when you're looking at them through creek water. Different hair. Different voices. Same ending. Over and over. Like a hymn nobody wanted to sing, but everybody knew the words to. Because that's what it was. A hymn. A ritual. Write the letter. Wait for the reply. Watch them arrive, with their eyes full of something that looked like hope, and felt, later, like a mistake they were making in real time. And then watch them leave. By October of 1872, Ezekiel Wren had stopped writing letters altogether. He told himself it was practical. Told himself there was no sense throwing good money after bad. No sense hauling another stranger up 7,000 feet of granite and pine just to haul her back down again 3 days or 3 weeks later. Told himself a man could get used to anything. Even this. Even the particular flavor of quiet that filled a cabin built for 2, but occupied by 1. He almost believed it. Almost. The cabin sat on a shelf of rock above a valley, so beautiful it made your chest hurt to look at it straight on. He'd built it himself. 2 years of hauling timber up from the tree line, of chinking the gaps with mud and moss, until the walls held heat the way a held grudge holds weight. He'd built it tight enough that the wind couldn't find its way in, not even in January, Not even when the storms came screaming down out of the Canadian territories like they had a score to settle. He'd built it for a life. A wife. Maybe children. Someday, though he didn't let himself finish that thought most days. He'd built it the way a man builds a promise. Board by board. Nail by nail. Believing, the whole time, that someone was coming to fill the second half of it. Nobody had. His brother Thomas wrote, from California twice a year, regular as the seasons, and every letter said some version of the same thing. You'll die up there alone, Zeke. You're too hard for this world. Come down off that mountain before it swallows you whole. Ezekiel burned most of those letters. Not out of anger. Out of something closer to agreement. Because maybe Thomas was right. Maybe he was too hard. Too silent. Too rough around every edge a person could have an edge on. He'd tried bending. Once or twice. Back when he still thought bending was something a man could learn like a trade. Tried softening his voice. Tried filling silences that didn't need filling. Tried smiling at moments, when smiling felt like lifting a stone with his face. It hadn't worked. The brides had left anyway. So he stopped bending. Went back to being exactly what he was. A man built for granite and pine and cold that could kill you if you let your guard down for one careless hour. A man too much for anyone who wasn't built the same way. He was up on the shed roof, hammer in hand, patching a gap before the real snow came, when he saw the rider. October sun slanting hard and gold across the rocks, turning the whole world the color of an old coin. For one strange second, horse and rider looked like they were made out of that light. Poured from it. Then they got closer, and the light fell away, and it was just Amos Tilden on his tired buckskin mare. Same as always, same as every month for 3 years running. Got something for you. Amos called out, reining in at the base of the shed. Ezekiel climbed down, hammer still in his fist. If it's another letter from Thomas telling me to move to California, you can burn it yourself. Nope. Amos was already digging in his saddlebag. Different kind of letter. Came through the marriage service. Something went cold in Ezekiel's chest. Fast. Like a window thrown open in January. I canceled that listing, he said. Weeks ago. Must have been in the mail before you did. Amos held out an envelope. Cream paper. Good stock. The kind that costs something. You might want to read it before you decide what to do with it. Ezekiel wanted to throw it in the fire without even breaking the seal. Wanted to tell Amos to ride back down and inform whichever poor woman had written it that Ezekiel Wren was done. Closed for business. No longer accepting applications from anyone foolish enough to think a mountain like this could be tamed by wanting it tame. But Amos was already swinging back up into the saddle, and the letter was already in Ezekiel's hand. And something about the writing on the front, the strong slant of it, the way the E in his name had been formed, with a single confident stroke instead of the careful, apologetic loops most women used, made him hesitate. Thanks for the climb, he said instead. Don't mention it. Amos touched his hat. See you next month. If the snow lets me. Then he was gone, back down the trail, and Ezekiel was alone, with the letter in his hand, and the wind starting to pick up out of the north the way it always did, before the weather turned mean. Inside the cabin, he lit the lamp, though it was barely past 4 in the afternoon. October days went thin and blew this high up, the light draining out of the sky like water out of a cracked jar. He sat at the table he'd built, from ponderosa pine, and he turned the envelope over. Once. Twice. Then he opened it. 2 pages. Same strong hand throughout. Mr. Wren, I am writing in response to your advertisement, though I suspect by the time this reaches you, you may have given up expecting serious replies. I would not blame you for that. I have read enough about the life you describe to understand it is not suited to most people. I am not writing to convince you I am suited to it either. I am writing because I have spent most of my life failing to fit into places that were supposed to want me, and I have grown tired of pretending that failure was mine alone to carry. Ezekiel stopped. Read that line again. Failing to fit into places that were supposed to want me. He knew something about that. Knew it the way you know the ache in an old brake, right before the weather changes. My name is Winifred Hollis. I am 31 years old. I kept the books for Danforth Shipping in Helena for 6 years, and I was good at it, better than good, and I was let go regardless. Not for any error in the ledgers. The owner told me, to my face, that his customers preferred to imagine a different sort of woman handling their accounts. A smaller sort. He did not say the word he meant. He did not need to. I have spent my whole life having that word said around me instead of to me, which somehow makes it worse. I do not believe in fairy tales, Mr. Wren. I do not expect softness, and I do not offer it in return. I expect honest work and honest silence, and a life that does not require me to apologize for the space I take up in it. If that is what you are still offering, I will come. Please do not answer unless you are certain. I have no more patience left for another failed attempt at belonging somewhere. Sincerely, Winifred Hollis. He set the letter down, picked it up again, read it a third time, slower, like he was trying to find the trick in it. The part where she'd soften, apologize, plead. It wasn't there. Not one line of it asked him for anything he wasn't already prepared to give. Too much space. He knew that phrase, too. Had heard some version of it his whole life. From a foreman who'd fired him for fighting. From a woman in Butte who'd liked him fine right up, until she understood he wasn't moving to town for her. From his own brother, who'd said once, not unkindly, "You take up too much room in a room, Zeke." Always have. He sat there, while the lamp burned lower, and the wind found its voice outside, working itself up into something with real teeth. Snow was coming. He could feel it in the air, that particular pressure that settled into a man's joints before the first real storm of the season. If he was going to answer, it had to be now. Another few weeks and the pass would close. Wouldn't open again till spring. He pulled out paper. Ink. The pen he almost never used, because there was almost never anyone to write to. He stared at the blank page for a long time. Then he wrote 3 words. Come, if certain. He sealed it. Set it by the door for Amos's next run. Then he sat back in the dark and waited for the doubt to come. The voice that always came, telling him this was a mistake, another stranger who'd take one look and understand she'd misjudged the whole arrangement. The doubt didn't come, or if it did, it was quieter than the wind. Quiet enough that he almost missed it. Almost. 300 miles east, in a house that had never once felt like hers, Winifred Hollis stood at a window and watched rain streak down the glass in long gray ropes, and she thought about the letter she'd sent, and she thought, not for the first time, that she might have just made the worst decision of her life. Except what was the alternative? Staying here, in her sister's house, in her sister's spare room, eating her sister's food, and absorbing her sister's sighs, the small ones, the ones Constance thought were too quiet to be heard. They weren't. Winifred heard every one of them. Heard them at breakfast, heard them at supper, heard them loudest of all on the evenings, when Constance had company, and found some reason, always some perfectly reasonable reason, why Winifred ought to take her tray upstairs instead of joining them. Because appearances mattered. Constance never said that part out loud. She didn't have to. Winifred pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and thought about the man on the mountain. Ezekiel Wren. She'd read the advertisement in the Helena paper 3 times before she let herself believe it was real. Mountain man. Hardy. Self-sufficient. Not seeking beauty. Seeking survival. Not seeking beauty. She'd read that line and felt something crack open in her chest that she hadn't expected. Not hope exactly. Hope was too soft a word for it. Something harder. Something closer to defiance. Because every other advertisement she'd read, every other letter, from every other lonely man scattered across this territory, had spent 3 paragraphs describing the wife he wanted before he'd spent 1 sentence describing the life he was offering. Pretty, pleasant, small enough to fit in his arms, small enough to fit in the shape of what he already believed a woman should be. Ezekiel Wren's letter hadn't done that. His advertisement hadn't done that. His 3-word reply, when it finally came, hadn't done that either. Come, if certain. She'd read those 3 words so many times the paper had started to soften at the fold. There was no flourish in them, no performance, just a door, held open exactly, as wide as it needed to be, and nothing more. She was certain. She'd been certain the moment she read the word survival, and understood, all the way down in her bones, that surviving was something she already knew how to do. Had been doing it her whole life, in rooms far more crowded, and far less honest than any mountain could ever be. Her sister found her at the window an hour later, and her sister's voice carried, that particular register it always carried, when she was about to say something cruel dressed up as concern. "You're really going through with this?" Not a question. Constance never asked Winifred questions. She made statements and waited to see if Winifred had the nerve to contradict them. "I am a mountain man in Montana." "Winifred, you don't even know what he looks like." "I don't need to know what he looks like. You'll freeze. I've been cold before. You'll be alone." Winifred turned from the window then, finally, and looked at her sister full in the face. Constance, who was 3 years older and 2 dress sizes smaller, and had never once, not in 31 years, called Winifred by any endearment softer than her full given name. "I am alone here, Constance," Winifred said. "I have been alone here for a year. The only difference is that here, I am alone in a house full of people who wish I would take up less of it." Constance's mouth opened, closed. For once, she didn't have an answer ready. Winifred packed that night. 2 trunks, practical dresses, sturdy boots, the small collection of books she couldn't bear to leave behind. She packed with hands that didn't shake, though something underneath her ribs was doing something that felt an awful lot like trembling. Because this was real now. Because in 3 days she would board a stagecoach, and in a week, or more after, that she would be standing on a mountain in front of a man who'd never seen her face, who knew nothing about her except that she was tired of pretending, and good at numbers, and 31 years old, and done, finally, and completely done, waiting for permission to exist. She told herself the fear didn't matter. She told herself a lot of things that week. The stagecoach ride to Helena took 4 days and felt like 40. Winifred spent most of it watching the country change outside the window, the flat brown plains giving way, slowly, to hills, and then the hills giving way to something that could only be called mountains, jagged and blue-gray, and utterly indifferent to whatever small human dramas were unfolding at their feet. She thought, more than once, about turning back, except every time the thought surfaced, she pushed it back down. Because turning back meant Constance's house, meant the spare room, and the trays sent upstairs, and the particular quality of silence that fell over a room when Winifred entered it wearing anything that showed the shape of her arms. She'd rather freeze on a mountain than suffocate in that silence one more year. In Helena, she rented a room for 2 nights, while she arranged for a horse and a guide to take her the rest of the way. The man at the livery stable looked her up and down when she asked about the trail to Wren's place, and something in his expression made her chin come up a half inch before she'd even decided to lift it. "That's a hard climb for anybody," he said. "Especially for A." He stopped himself, didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. "Especially for a what?" Winifred said. Flat. Not a question. The man had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I only meant. I know exactly what you meant." She counted out the coin for the horse. "I'll manage the climb. You just worry about the saddle." She rode out 3 mornings later with a young guide named Dell, who talked entirely too much and asked no questions at all, which suited her fine. The trail climbed steadily for 2 days, the air growing thinner and colder with every mile, the pines growing taller and darker until they blotted out most of the sky. On the second night, camped in a hollow beside a creek that ran fast and loud with early snowmelt, Dell finally worked up the nerve to ask, "You know him, Wren?" "No. Never met him." "No." Dell chewed on that for a while, poking at the fire with a stick. He's had some trouble keeping folks up there. If you don't mind me saying. I know about the other women." Winifred kept her eyes on the flames. 5 of them, I understand." "Yes, ma'am." "What happened to them?" Dell shrugged, the particular shrug of a young man who knows more than he's willing to say outright. "Different things happened to different ones. But mostly." He hesitated. "Mostly they just looked at him, and looked at the mountain, and decided they'd made a mistake." Winifred was quiet for a long moment. "And what do you think?" she said finally. "Do you think I'll make the same decision?" Dell looked at her, really looked, for the first time since they'd set out. Something in his face shifted. Not pity. Something closer to respect, though he was too young to have the word for it yet. "No, ma'am," he said. "I don't believe you strike me as the deciding you've made a mistake type." Winifred almost smiled. Almost. They rode out the next morning under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, purple-gray and low, heavy with weather that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be rain or something worse. The climb grew steeper. The trail narrowed until it was barely wide enough for the horses to walk single file, granite rising sheer on one side, the valley falling away into blue distance on the other. Winifred rode straight back the whole way, refused to let her spine curve, refused to let her hands shake on the reins, though the drop beside the trail made her stomach lurch every time she let herself look at it directly. Because this was the test. She understood that, somewhere in the animal part of her brain, that had spent 31 years learning to read a room, before the room finished reading her. This climb, this cold, this thin gray air. This was the first question the mountain was asking her, before Ezekiel Wren ever asked a single one of his own. Can you survive here? She intended to answer with her whole body, not with words, with the simple, undeniable fact of arriving. Ezekiel was splitting firewood when he heard it. The sound of a horse laboring through the last stretch of trail before the clearing, hooves striking granite in a rhythm that meant hard climbing, meant a rider who knew how to push an animal without breaking it. He set down the axe, told himself it was probably Amos, told himself that even as some part of him, some part he didn't examine too closely, knew it wasn't Amos's rhythm at all. He walked to the edge of the clearing. The sun had broken through for a moment, hard and cold, and blinding off the fresh dusting of snow that had fallen overnight, and for a few seconds all he could see was light. White and gold, and impossible to look it straight on. He shielded his eyes. Then the rider came clear of the trees, and the light fell away, and he saw her. She was on a gray gelding, sitting straight in the saddle despite what had clearly been hours of hard climbing. A heavy wool coat, practical boots, a hat pulled low against the wind, low enough that he couldn't see her face yet, only the set of her shoulders, square and unbowed. And she was larger than he'd expected. Not in a way he had words ready for, not in that first half second, because he hadn't let himself picture anything at all, had told himself picturing was a fool's game, after 5 women who'd never matched whatever picture he'd allowed himself to hold. But some part of him, some old, unexamined, deeply buried part, had pictured something anyway. Everyone did. That was the truth nobody said out loud. And for 1/2 of 1 second, something crossed his face. He didn't choose it. That was the terrible part. He didn't decide to feel it, didn't reach for it on purpose. It simply arrived, the way weather arrives, the way an old ache arrives right before a storm. A flicker. Small. Fast. Gone almost before it had finished happening, but not gone before she saw it. She reined the gelding to a stop 10 feet from where he stood. Looked at him, steady, unhurried, the way a person looks at a fact they've already decided to accept regardless of how they feel about it. Ezekiel Wren? Her voice was low. Clear. Unafraid. That's right. She dismounted. Smooth. No hesitation, no fumbling with her skirts the way the others had, sliding down off the gelding like she'd been doing it her whole life. Which, he'd learn later, she had. She stood facing him across the snow, tall enough that she had to tip her chin only slightly to meet his eyes. Broad through the shoulders, broad everywhere, built solid the way the mountain itself was built solid, and her face was strong-boned, and direct, and entirely unwilling to look away from him. Winifred Hollis, she said, I got your letter. 3 words. He'd sent her 3 words, and here she was, 3,000 feet of climbing, and 4 days of stagecoach, and a lifetime of other people's opinions later, standing in front of him, because of 3 words. You came, he said, and heard, the instant it left his mouth, exactly how foolish it sounded. I said I would. She glanced past him, at the cabin, the shed, the lean-to, where his horses stood watching, with mild curiosity. Then her gaze came back to him, and something in her expression changed. Sharpened. You looked at me, she said. Quiet. Not an accusation exactly. Worse than an accusation. A simple statement of fact, laid down between them like a card turned face up on a table. Just now, when I came out of the trees. Ezekiel felt his jaw tighten. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. She held his eyes, didn't blink, didn't soften. You looked at me the way every single person in Helena looked at me. The liveryman, the clerk who sold me my ticket, my own sister, every day for a year. That look, I know it the way I know my own name, Mr. Wren, and you gave it to me for exactly half a second before you remembered you weren't supposed to. The silence that followed had weight to it. Real weight, like something you could put your hand against and feel pushed back. Ezekiel opened his mouth, closed it, because what was there to say? She was right. He knew she was right, knew it with the same cold certainty he'd have felt if she'd pointed out a lie he'd told and been caught in. There was no version of denying it. That wouldn't make it worse. I did, he said finally. Winifred's chin came up another half-inch. She hadn't expected the admission. He could see, that much, could see something flicker across her own face before she caught it and smoothed it away. Well, she said, at least you're honest about it. I wrote you 3 words asking you to be certain, Ezekiel said, and his voice was rougher than he meant it to be, rougher than he wanted it to be, but he pushed through anyway, because stopping now felt like a worse cowardice than the flicker had been. I should have been certain myself before I sent them. And are you? I don't know yet. At least that's honest too. She looked past him again, at the cabin, at the mountains rising sheer on every side, at the valley dropping away below into blue distance. Took it all in, with the same steady, assessing look she'd given him. Then she looked back. So what happens now, she said. You send me back down the mountain the way you sent the others? Save us both the trouble of finding out whether you can manage to look at me properly a second time? No. The word came out fast. Faster than he expected. No. I said come if certain. You came. He made himself hold her eyes, though it cost him something to do it. Something he didn't have a name for yet. I'm not going to punish you for a look I gave you, before I had the sense to catch it. That's not an apology. I know it isn't. Then give me one. He almost smiled. Almost, though nothing about this moment felt like it had room for smiling in it. You don't strike me as a woman who wants an apology handed to her for free, Miss Hollis. Strikes me you'd rather I earn it. Something shifted in her face, just slightly, the barest loosening around her eyes, gone as quickly as it came. That, she said, is the first thing you've said that I actually believe. The gelding shifted its weight, blew out a long breath that fogged in the cold air, and the ordinary sound of it seemed to break something loose in the moment, let air back into a conversation that had been holding its breath. Your horse needs tending, Ezekiel said. I know. She was already unbuckling the saddlebags, movements quick and competent. Show me where. He led her to the lean-to, watched, without meaning to watch, so closely, as she unsaddled the gelding herself, refusing his offer to help, with a single sharp look, and rubbed the animal down, with handfuls of dry grass, checking its hooves for packed ice, with hands that were sure and unhurried. She worked the way a person works, who has never once in her life had the luxury of standing around waiting for someone else to do a thing for her. When the horse was settled, blanketed, given hay, she straightened and looked at him. Where do I sleep? Direct. No pretense, no delicate circling of the question. Cabin, he said. There's a room in back. Small. Nothing fancy. I don't need fancy. She walked toward the cabin, and he found himself following her, which felt backward, felt like the visitor leading and the host trailing behind, and he didn't examine too closely why. That unsettled him. Inside, she set down her bags and looked around slowly. The single large room, the stone fireplace along the north wall, the kitchen area, the table he'd built himself out of ponderosa pine. Clean. Functional. Nothing on the walls, nothing soft anywhere, just the bare bones of a life built by a man who'd stopped expecting anyone else to live it alongside him. She walked its length, touched the table, examined the fireplace, checked the seal on the windows, with 2 fingers pressed against the frame, testing for drafts the way a person tests a thing they intend to rely on. Then she went to the back room, looked inside, came back out. Good, she said. That's it. Good. Would you rather I performed disappointment for you? One eyebrow lifted just slightly, pretended to be delicate about it, so you could feel needed, reassuring me? I don't perform, Mr. Wren. Good is what you get. She started unbuttoning her coat, movements brisk, already moving on to the next practical matter. I'll need water to wash. Then I'll see about supper. Do you have food, or should I have brought more? I have food. Show me. He showed her the pantry, and she went, through it methodically, running her fingers along the jars, checking the dates he'd written on the labels in his own blunt hand. Dried meat, cornmeal, beans, flour, the last of the summer's canned tomatoes. This will do, she said. Better stock than I expected. Winter up here runs 6 months some years. You learn to prepare. Or you die. Or you die. Something almost like amusement crossed her face, there and gone, quick as a bird passing over the sun. I like that. Keep being honest with me and we'll get along fine. She rolled up her sleeves. He stood there, useless, in his own kitchen, in a way he hadn't felt useless in years, because the other women had needed instruction, needed hand-holding, through every unfamiliar task, and Winifred Hollis needed exactly none of that. She found the knives without asking. Found the pots. Moved through his kitchen like she'd already decided it belonged to her, as much as it belonged to him. Decided it before he'd had the chance to offer or withhold that belonging. You going to stand there, she said, without looking up, from the potatoes she'd started peeling. Or are you going to help? What do you need? Water. Fire built up under that stove properly, not the sorry excuse of a flame you've got going now. Then get out of my way. He almost laughed. Didn't. But it was close. Closer than laughter had come in longer than he wanted to admit. He hauled water. Built up the fire. By the time he'd finished, she had the potatoes peeled and dried venison soaking, and the whole cabin had started to smell like something other than wood smoke and cold stone for the first time in longer than he could remember. Dinner was the best meal he'd eaten in months. She served it, without ceremony, a thick stew of potatoes and meat, bread made somehow, from his own meager supplies, coffee stronger and better than anything he'd ever managed to brew himself. They ate across the table, from each other in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, so much as it was unfamiliar, two strangers testing the weight of quiet between them, seeing if it would hold. Where'd you learn to cook like this? He asked, eventually, because the silence had gone on long enough that he felt he ought to fill some of it. My mother, before she died. Winifred didn't look up from her bowl. After that, I cooked for my father and kept the accounts for his business, and I was good at both. And neither one of those things ever seemed to count for much once people got a good look at me across a room. You said in your letter you kept books. For Danforth Shipping, in Helena. 6 years. Something flattened in her voice. Best set of ledgers that firm ever had. I caught 2 embezzlement schemes the owner's own son ran right under his nose. Saved that company more money in 6 years than it paid me in wages. And they let you go anyway. They let me go because a new client came in for a tour of the office and made a comment. Not even to me. About me. Loud enough that he knew I'd hear it, and quiet enough that he could pretend he hadn't meant for me to. Her jaw tightened, just slightly. The owner apologized to the client. Not to me. Then he found a reason, 3 weeks later, that my services were no longer required. Ezekiel set down his spoon. That's a fool's decision, he said. Flat. Certain. Man who'd trade good bookkeeping for a stranger's comfort isn't fit to run a business. Winifred looked up at that. Really looked at him, something recalibrating behind her eyes. Most people tell me it must have been a misunderstanding, she said. That surely I've exaggerated it somehow, in the retelling. I'm not most people. No. Something in her face shifted, softened at the very edges, though her voice stayed level. You're not. Though you did give me that look. I did. And you're not going to pretend you didn't again. No. He held her eyes. I won't. She nodded, once, like she was filing that fact away somewhere permanent. Then she picked her spoon back up, and they ate the rest of the meal in a silence that felt, somehow, lighter than the one before it. Not solved, not finished, but started at least. A door cracked open instead of shut. Outside, the wind was picking up again, rattling the shutters, working itself towards something with real teeth in it. You'll be snowed in soon, Ezekiel said. Might not see the trail again till spring. Winifred set down her spoon, looked at him directly, the way she'd looked at him in the clearing, unblinking and certain. I'm not leaving, she said. You don't know that yet. You've been here 3 hours. I know it anyway. She folded her arms. I've spent 31 years trying to make myself fit into rooms that had already decided, before I walked in, that I didn't belong there. I know what that feels like in my body, Mr. Wren, The way you know a storm is coming, before the sky tells you plainly. This doesn't feel like that. You haven't seen a real winter up here. No, but I've seen real loneliness. I've stood in rooms full of people and felt more alone than I imagine I'll ever feel on this mountain, with just you and the wind for company. She lifted her chin. I'll take the snow, gladly, over one more year of that particular kind of empty. He studied her across the table, the lamplight carving her face into planes of gold and shadow, strong and unflinching, and he found he had no ready answer for that. None at all. The other women left, he said instead, because it felt like something he owed her, some warning laid plainly on the table between them. All 5 of them. One lasted almost 2 months. Most didn't make it a week. I'm not the other women. No, Ezekiel agreed, quiet. You're not. That night, lying in his bed, with the thin wall between them, he listened to the wind and to the small, unfamiliar sounds of another person settling into the room beside his, and he found himself doing something he hadn't let himself do in longer than he cared to count. He found himself hoping. It was a dangerous thing, hope. Made a man believe in outcomes he had no business believing in. Made him think, for one reckless half-formed moment, that maybe the flicker she'd caught on his face in the clearing didn't have to be the whole truth of him. That maybe a man could be caught doing the wrong thing, and still, given the chance, choose to do the right one after. He didn't know yet whether that was true, but for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, he wanted it to be. Morning came hard and pale, frost silvering the inside of the windows. Ezekiel woke to the sound of someone already moving in the main room, and for one disoriented moment he forgot, entirely, that he wasn't alone in the cabin anymore. Then he remembered. Sat up too fast, head spinning slightly with it. Winifred was at the stove when he came out, dressed, hair pulled back, coffee already brewing. She glanced at him, assessing, the way she seemed to assess everything. Snow's starting, she said. Came in overnight. He went to the window. She was right. The world outside had gone soft and white. The trees bowed under a fresh dusting, more coming down steady out of a sky the color of old pewter. Storm season's here, he said. This won't be the last one, before the pass closes for good. Good. Winifred poured coffee, handed him a cup, without asking whether he wanted it. Means I don't have to spend any more energy convincing you I'm staying. The mountain will decide, that part for both of us. He wrapped his hands around the warm cup and studied her, over the rim of it. There was something steady in her, something that hadn't wavered once, since she'd ridden out of the trees the day before, not even in the moment she'd caught him at his worst. You're not scared, he said. Not quite a question. I'm terrified, Winifred said, without missing a beat, without any shame in the admission. I've never spent a winter anywhere like this. I've never been this far, from a doctor, a neighbor, another living soul besides you. I have every reason in the world to be scared, Mr. Wren, and I am. Doesn't sound like it. That's because I've had a great deal of practice doing frightening things, while looking like I'm not frightened at all. She set down the coffee pot. Met his eyes squarely. It's a skill you develop, when the world spends 30 years teaching you, that showing fear only gives people one more reason to underestimate you. Something in Ezekiel's chest tightened, hearing that. An old, familiar ache, recognizing itself in someone else's words for the first time in longer than he could remember. I know something about that, he said, quiet. I imagine you do. Winifred's gaze softened, just at the edges. 5 women looked at this mountain, and ran, and I'd wager every one of them told themselves it was the cold, or the distance, or the silence, that scared them off. But I don't think that's the whole truth of it, is it? What do you think the truth is? I think, Winifred said slowly, that most people, when they meet something too large to fit comfortably into the shape they expected, run from the largeness rather than admit the shape they expected was too small to begin with. She held his eyes. I know that feeling, from the other side of it, Mr. Wren. I've spent my whole life being the thing too large for the room. The wind hammered against the walls, and the fire cracked and settled, and Ezekiel stood there, with his coffee going cold in his hands, looking at a woman who had somehow, in less than a day, said out loud the exact shape of the thing he'd never once managed to say about himself. I don't want you to leave, he said. The words came out rougher than he meant them, rougher and more honest than he'd planned on being this early, this fast. Winifred studied him for a long moment. Searching his face for the flicker again, he understood, checking to see whether it would return now, that the words had left his mouth. It didn't. Good, she said finally. Because I already told you. I'm not going anywhere. She turned back to the stove, breakfast, the ordinary business of the morning, and Ezekiel stood there a moment longer, watching her move through his kitchen like she'd already claimed it, thinking that maybe, just maybe, 3 words scrawled on a page in October had turned out to be the truest thing he'd ever written. The days that followed fell into a shape neither of them had planned, but both of them, it seemed, were willing to build. Winifred worked, constantly, relentlessly, the way a person works, who has spent her whole life needing to prove her worth twice, over just to be granted half the credit anyone else received automatically. She reorganized his pantry, hung curtains sewn from scraps of old fabric she found in his trunk, scrubbed corners of the cabin that hadn't seen a rag in longer than he wanted to admit. And she talked, when the work allowed it, in that low, direct voice of hers, telling him pieces of her life the way a person hands over stones one at a time, testing whether he'd drop them. She told him about her father, who had loved her, she thought, in his own limited way, but had never once told her, so outright, because affection, in that house, had always come dressed up as criticism instead. Eat less, Winifred. Sit straighter, Winifred. You'll never catch a husband looking like that, Winifred. She told him about the 3 marriage proposals she'd turned down, not because the men had been cruel exactly, but because every one of them had made it clear, in ways large and small, that marrying her would be an act of charity on their part rather than a choice made from wanting. I'd rather be alone, she said one evening, mending one of his shirts by lamplight, than spend my whole life grateful to someone for tolerating me. That's not a small thing to say. It's not a small thing to have lived. She bit off the thread. What about you? Why the mail-order brides, and not some woman, from Helena or Butte? Tried that. Ezekiel stared into the fire. Women in town want a man willing to move to town. I'm not built for that. This is where I fit. Down there, everyone's watching everyone else, judging everyone else, and I can't breathe in it the way I can breathe up here. I understand that better than you might think. Winifred held up the shirt, examining her stitches. My sister used to tell me I needed to learn to take up less space. Talk less. Want less. What did you tell her? That I'd rather suffocate. Something passed between them then, wordless, a recognition neither of them had words ready for yet. 2 people who had both, in their own separate rooms and separate cities, learned the exact same lesson about what the world expected them to fold themselves down into, and had both, somewhere along the way, decided they'd rather break than fold. Outside, the wind kept building. Inside, something else was building too, slower, quieter, harder to name. It was on the 4th morning, the storm having finally broken overnight into a hard, bright, blinding stillness, that Amos Tilden made what would be his last climb before the pass closed for the season. He arrived windburned and grinning, clearly delighted to find Winifred still there, still unpacking supplies from the shed, still very much present. Well, I'll be. He swung down off his mare. You're the first one who didn't run screaming back down the mountain. I don't run, Winifred said, and there was something in her voice, dry and sharp, that made Amos laugh outright. No, ma'am. I don't suppose you do. He handed over the mail pouch, mostly newspapers, and one more letter, that made Ezekiel's stomach drop the moment he recognized the handwriting on the front. Not Thomas's hand. Not his brother's careful, worried script. This was different. Formal. A stranger's hand, and beneath it, a return address that turned something cold in Ezekiel's chest for the 2nd time in a week. Cyrus Voss. Voss Freight and Transport, Helena, Montana Territory. Trouble? Amos asked, watching his face. Don't know yet. Ezekiel turned the envelope over. The seal was already broken, resealed clumsily, like it had been opened and read by someone before it ever reached him. Winifred came to stand beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth off her, close enough that some part of him, some old instinct he hadn't examined too closely yet, found that nearness steadying rather than strange. Who's Cyrus Voss? She asked. Runs the freight company that shares the boundary line down along the eastern ridge. Ezekiel broke the fresh seal, unfolded the letter inside, and felt something go still and cold and careful in his chest as he read. Land my father filed on, back before the war, before I was even born. And Ezekiel read it once. Read it again, slower, making sure he hadn't misunderstood a single word of it. And, he said, and his voice had gone flat in a way Winifred hadn't heard from him yet, flat the way a man's voice goes when he's holding something much larger than the words he's actually saying. Mr. Voss informs me that a survey of the county records has turned up an irregularity in my father's original filing. An irregularity he intends to have corrected in his favor. The wind moved through the pines outside, low and steady, and somewhere down in the valley the first true silence of winter was beginning to settle over the whole territory, sealing the pass, sealing the trail, sealing all three of them, Amos included for one more hour at least, into a world that had suddenly gotten a great deal smaller and a great deal more dangerous than it had been the day before. Winifred looked at the letter in Ezekiel's hands, then at his face. He's trying to take your land, she said. Not a question. Looks that way. Can he? Ezekiel folded the letter. Slow. Careful. The kind of careful a man gets when he's already deciding, somewhere underneath the calm, exactly how hard he's willing to fight. Not while I'm standing on it, he said. Not without a fight he isn't going to enjoy. Amos, still standing by his mare, let out a low whistle. Voss doesn't lose fights, Zeke. Not the kind that happen in a courtroom, anyhow. Neither do I, Ezekiel said. Not on my own ground. He looked over at Winifred then, standing beside him in the thin, hard, beautiful light of a mountain morning, snow stretching white and unbroken in every direction, the pass about to close behind them for the whole long winter. Whatever this was between them, whatever they'd started to build in 4 short days, it was about to be tested by something a great deal larger than either one of them had bargained for. And neither of them, standing therein, that cold, bright silence, had any idea, yet exactly how large. The pass closed 9 days after Amos Tilden's last climb. Closed the way it always closed. Not gently, not with warning. One morning the trail was there, gray and rutted and passable, and by the next it was gone under 4 feet of snow, so fine and dry it lifted off the drifts and sheets whenever the wind found an angle to work with, which it always did. Ezekiel Wren had lived, through 9 winters on, that mountain, and every single one of them had taught him the same lesson twice. That the cold didn't care about your plans. That the wind didn't care about your grief, your hope, your unfinished business, with a man 3 ridges over who wanted your land, and didn't much care how he got it. The mountain simply closed its fist, and whatever you'd built inside, that fist, you were stuck living inside it until spring. Winifred Hollis had never lived through a winter like it. Said so, plainly, the first night the wind came down hard enough to make the whole cabin groan like something alive and troubled by its own weight. I didn't know silence could be this loud, she said. She was standing at the window, arms folded, watching a world that had gone entirely white, entirely featureless, the shed and the lean-to and the tree line all swallowed into one long unbroken sheet of gray-white nothing. You get used to it, Ezekiel said. Do you? He thought about that. Thought about it longer than he expected to. No, he admitted. You just learn to carry it different. She turned from the window, looked at him, with something unreadable behind her eyes. That's the most honest thing you've said to me yet. I've been honest with you since the clearing. You have. A small, careful nod. Which is more than I can say for most people I've known. Because that was the shape their days had started taking. Small honesties, traded back and forth across a table built for one man eating alone, now set with 2 plates and 2 cups, and a silence that was slowly, carefully, learning how to be something other than empty. It wasn't easy. It was never going to be easy. 2 people who had each spent 31 years learning to survive, without anyone else's help, didn't simply fold together like dough. They collided, struck sparks, found, over and over, the places where their separate hard-won independence rubbed raw against the others. The fight over the table happened on the 12th day. Ezekiel came in, from checking the lean-to, and found the whole main room rearranged. The table shoved from its place by the fire to sit instead beneath the east window. The chairs turned to face it differently. Even the shelf of dishes moved 2 feet to the left, closer to the stove. He stood in the doorway, snow still on his shoulders, and felt something tighten low in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. What happened here? I moved the table. Winifred didn't look up from the bread she was kneading. The light's better by the window, and you were forever bumping your hip on the corner of it where it sat before. You didn't ask. That got her attention. She looked up, flour on her hands, on her forearms, a smear of it along her jaw, where she'd pushed back a loose strand of hair. I didn't realize I needed your permission to arrange furniture in my own home. It's been arranged that way 3 years, and it's been wrong for 3 years. She went back to the dough, hard, sharp motions that had nothing to do with bread anymore. Help me finish moving the shelf, or get out of my way. Something old rose up in him then. Something he didn't like the shape of once he'd felt it fully. Because it wasn't really about the table. He knew that, even as the words were already climbing up his throat, already reaching for the air. This is still my cabin. The kneading stopped. Winifred set both floured hands flat on the table. Went very still. Your cabin. She said it slow. Careful. The way a person repeats a thing they want to make certain they heard correctly. I see. I didn't mean. You meant exactly what you said, Mr. Wren. Her chin came up. That same half-inch he'd watched rise on the day she rode out of the trees, the day she'd caught the flicker on his face and named it, before he'd had the chance to hide it. I've cooked every meal in this kitchen for 12 days. Mended your clothes. Hauled water beside you in weather that would have sent most men crawling back to their beds. And you're telling me this is still yours? That's not. Then what is it exactly? She crossed her arms, flour dusting pale against the dark wool of her sleeve. Because from where I'm standing, it sounds a great deal like every room I've ever been let into, on the understanding that I remain grateful for the privilege and small about my opinions while I'm there. Silence. Real silence, the kind with teeth in it. Ezekiel stood in the doorway, with the cold still clinging to his coat, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that he had just done the exact thing he'd sworn to himself he wouldn't do. Handed her, unasked, the same old wound she'd carried up the mountain in the first place. I'm not good at this, he said finally. Quiet. At what? At sharing space. He set down the water bucket he was still holding, hadn't even noticed he was still holding. I've been alone up here a long time, Winifred. Long enough that I don't always remember there's someone else who gets a say now. Something in her shoulders eased. Not all the way, but some. And now there is, she said. Now there is. She studied him a long moment. Flour still on her hands, the bread forgotten between them. I'm not trying to take this place from you, she said finally. I'm trying to make it ours. But I can't do that if every time I move a table 6 inches, you're going to remind me I'm only borrowing the room. I know. Do you? I'm learning it. He crossed the room, picked up the other end of the shelf she'd been dragging. Where do you want this? She blinked. Whatever fight she'd been braced to keep having, it wasn't the one he'd just handed her instead. By the stove, she said, slower now, so the plates stay warm. They moved it together, and when it was done, standing back to look at the room, Ezekiel had to admit, silently, that it did look better, lighter, less like a cave a man had crawled into to wait out his own life. We're going to fight again, Winifred said, that evening, over bread that had turned out fine despite everything. More than once. I'm not an easy woman to share a house with. Neither am I. Good. She tore off another piece of bread. Long as we're clear on it. He almost smiled. That was becoming a habit. The almost smiling. He'd catch himself doing it 3, 4 times a day now, some small unguarded thing rising up in his chest, before he remembered to keep his face the way he'd always kept it. Flat. Careful. Unreadable. Because that was easier. Had always been easier. Except it wasn't anymore. Not with her sitting across the table, watching him with those sharp, steady eyes that seemed to catch every flicker before he'd finished having it. The letter from Cyrus Voss sat folded on the shelf above the fireplace for 11 days before either of them spoke of it again. It was Winifred who broke first. Winifred, who had spent those 11 days doing something Ezekiel didn't notice until the 12th, when he found her at the table late one night. Lamp burned low, a stack of his father's old papers spread out in front of her in neat, deliberate rows. "What are you doing?" She didn't look up. "Reading." "Reading what?" "Every deed, filing, and survey document your father ever kept in that trunk under your bed." She turned a page, made a small mark in the margin with a stub of pencil. "You didn't think I'd let a man threaten to take your land without at least looking at the paperwork myself, did you?" Ezekiel came and stood behind her chair, looked down at the mess of documents, decades old, the ink faded to brown, his father's cramped, impatient handwriting scattered across half of them. "You can read this?" "I kept books for 6 years, Mr. Wren. I can read anything a man puts in front of me and find the lie in it faster than he can finish telling it." She tapped one page, "Which is exactly what I intend to do with whatever Cyrus Voss thinks he's found." Something in Ezekiel's chest loosened, just slightly, the first real loosening since the letter had arrived. "You think there's a lie in it?" "I think," Winifred said slowly, "that a man who runs a freight company busy enough to need a legal team on retainer doesn't usually go digging through 40-year-old county filings out of idle curiosity. Men like that go looking when they already believe there's something worth finding, which means either there's a genuine irregularity your father made honestly 40 years ago without meaning any harm by it, or Mr. Voss has decided to manufacture one." She looked up at him finally, lamplight catching the sharp planes of her face. "And I intend to find out which, before he has the chance to decide it for us in a courtroom, where we're not present to argue otherwise." Ezekiel looked at her for a long moment, at the stack of documents, at the careful, methodical marks in the margins, the same careful, methodical mind that had caught 2 embezzlement schemes right under the nose of men who'd never once thought to look past her size long enough to notice her sharpness. "Thank you," he said. Simple, direct. "Don't thank me yet." She turned back to the page. "Thank me when I've actually found something." It took her 3 more weeks. 3 weeks of long evenings by lamplight, the wind howling steady outside, while she cross-referenced boundary markers against creek beds that had shifted course over 4 decades, checked filing dates against a county ledger Amos had somehow, miraculously, managed to smuggle up the mountain on one last desperate run before the deepest snow sealed the pass for good. Ezekiel watched her work the way he might have watched a hawk circling, patient and certain, over ground it already knew held something worth the diving. "There," she said finally, one night in late December, tapping a page, so hard the lamp flame guttered. "There it is." "What?" "Your father's original filing lists the eastern boundary at the second creek crossing. Voss's claim moves it to the third." She spread 2 documents side by side. "Except the third creek crossing didn't exist in 1832, Ezekiel. The creeks changed course twice since then, once in a flood your father himself wrote about in his own journal. Voss is using a modern boundary marker to argue a historical claim that predates the marker's existence by nearly a decade." Ezekiel stared at the pages, at her finger, steady and certain, tracing the line between them. "You're certain?" "I'm certain enough to stake my reputation on it in front of any territorial judge with a working set of eyes." She sat back, something fierce and satisfied moving across her face. "It's not enough yet. We'll need the original county records, the ones from before the courthouse fire in '58, to prove the creek's original course beyond doubt. But it's a start. It's real ground to stand on. Where do we find those records?" "Helena." Winifred's jaw set. "Which means someone needs to make that ride once the pass opens enough to try it." Neither of them said, out loud, who that someone would have to be. They didn't need to. Some conversations finished themselves in the silence after, without either party having to speak the last line aloud. The first sign of real trouble came on a morning in early January, cold enough that the water in the bucket had frozen solid overnight despite sitting 6 feet from the banked coals. Ezekiel went out to feed the horses and found the fence along the eastern boundary cut clean, through in 3 places. Not weathered, not fallen, cut. Deliberate, careful work with a blade sharp enough to leave clean edges on frozen wire. He stood there a long moment in the gray early light, breath fogging, and understood exactly what he was looking at. A message. He didn't tell Winifred at first. Told himself it was, because there was no sense worrying her over a fence he could mend himself in an afternoon. Told himself that right up until she found the cut wire herself 2 days later, out checking the horses, while he split wood and came storming back into the cabin, with her jaw set hard enough to crack a walnut. You knew about this. I mended it. That's not what I asked. She dropped the length of cut wire on the table between them, hard enough to rattle the plates. You knew, and you didn't tell me. I didn't want you to worry. I am not, Winifred said, each word landing like a hammer strike. A woman who needs protecting from the truth of her own situation, Ezekiel Wren. I have spent my entire life being handled, being managed, being told, gently, kindly, for my own good, what I did and did not need to know about my own life. That's not what I don't care what you meant. Her voice cracked, just slightly, and something underneath the anger showed, through for one raw second, before she caught it and smoothed it back down. I need you to treat me like a partner in this. Not a woman you're sparing hard truths to spare her feelings. Can you do that? Ezekiel stood there, the cut wire between them on the table, and understood, with the same clean clarity as the moment in the clearing when she'd named his flicker before he could hide it, that she was right. Entirely right. Yes, he said. I can do that. You'd better. Her voice steadied. Because whatever Cyrus Voss is planning, he's planning it against both of us now. And I intend to fight it, with my eyes open, not with you deciding, on my behalf, which pieces of the danger I'm strong enough to look at. He nodded. Slow. Certain. Both of us, he agreed. From here on. The barn burned 11 nights later. Ezekiel woke to the smell of it first, sharp and wrong under the cabin door, before he ever heard the crackle or saw the orange light licking up against the underside of the low clouds. He was out the door in his shirt sleeves, boots half-laced, before he'd finished forming the thought all the way. Winifred was 2 steps behind him, already pulling her coat on, over her nightclothes, already moving with the same grim, fast competence she brought to every crisis that had crossed their path since October. The shed, not the main barn, thankfully. Small mercy, but it held half their winter feed and half their tools, and it was already fully involved by the time they reached it, flames climbing 30 feet into the black sky, throwing heat so fierce they couldn't get within 20 feet of the door. The horses, Winifred shouted, over the roar of it. Lean-tos separate. They're clear. Ezekiel was already grabbing buckets, though some cold, clear part of his mind already understood there was nothing left to save. Get water from the creek. Fast as you can. They fought it for an hour. Buckets, snow thrown by the shovelful, everything either of them could think to try. By the time the flames finally guttered down to embers, the shed was gone. Feed, tools, the sled he'd built 2 winters back. All of it, ash and char smoking against the snow. Winifred stood beside him in the freezing dark, soot streaked across her face, breath coming hard. That wasn't an accident, she said. No. How do you know? Ezekiel crouched, pointed at a place along the shed's foundation, where the char pattern ran wrong. Too even, too deliberate, a line of scorching that didn't match the way an accidental fire climbed and spread. Started here. Low. Outside wall. His jaw was tight enough to ache. Somebody poured something. Coal oil, most like. And lit it, from outside, where nobody'd see the flame catch till it was already past stopping. Winifred was quiet a long moment, looking at the smoking ruin of it. Voss. Can't prove it. I don't need proof to know it in my bones. Her voice had gone flat, hard, dangerous in a way he hadn't heard from her before. He's done asking politely, Ezekiel. He's moved to taking. They stood together in the cold, in the smoke, in the wreckage of half a winter's careful preparation, and neither of them said the thing they were both thinking. That it would get worse before it got better. It got worse 3 days after that. The well went bad on a Thursday morning. Winifred noticed it first, drawing water for the coffee, catching a smell underneath the cold, clean scent she'd come to expect from that particular bucket. Something sour. Wrong. She didn't drink it. Didn't let Ezekiel drink it either, though he'd already lifted the cup halfway to his mouth, before her sharp words stopped him cold. Don't. What? Smell it first. He did, and went very still. That's not natural, he said. No. They hauled the well water out bucket by frozen bucket, dumping it well clear of the cabin, and found, at the very bottom, once the level dropped low enough to see, a dead animal wedged deliberately against the stone lining. Not fallen in by accident. Wedged. Placed. Ezekiel's hands, hauling the carcass out, with a length of rope, were shaking by the time he finished. Not from cold. This isn't a man trying to scare us off his land dispute, Winifred said quietly, watching him work. This is a man trying to kill us, and make it look like misfortune. I know. We can't stay here drinking creek water through the rest of winter. I know that too. She looked at him. Really looked, the same steady, assessing look she'd given him in the clearing back in October, except there was something new in it now. Something that hadn't been there before. Not fear exactly. Fear folded up small, and put away someplace useful, replaced with something harder. Then we fight, she said. Properly. Not waiting for spring, not waiting for the pass to open, so we can ride to Helena, and do this the slow, careful way. We fight him now, with whatever we've got. What do you have in mind? Winifred's jaw set. I finished proving that boundary was moved, she said. Every scrap of evidence I can find in this cabin, in your father's papers, in anything Amos manages to smuggle up here, before the deep snow shuts everything down completely. And when the pass opens even a crack, I ride to Helena myself, and I put it in front of a judge, before Cyrus Voss has the chance to bury us both under something worse than a burned shed and a poisoned well. You'd ride alone, in this weather, into a town where the man trying to destroy us has money and lawyers and half the county in his pocket. Yes, Winifred, I have spent my whole life being told I was too much to be taken seriously in a room full of men deciding things, she said, cutting him off, voice steady as granite. I intend to walk into that courtroom and prove every single one of them wrong at once. Don't you dare tell me I can't. He looked at her a long moment, at the soot still smudged along her jaw, the frozen well water dripping off her sleeves, the fierce, unbending set of her shoulders. I wasn't going to tell you that, he said quietly. I was going to tell you I'm coming with you. Something in her face cracked open, just slightly, the fierce certainty softening for one unguarded second, into something closer to relief. Good, she said, because I wasn't going to ask permission either way. The threat came in person 8 days later. 3 riders, coming up the trail in weather no sensible man rode in, wrapped heavy against a cold that had settled into the 20 below range and showed no sign of lifting. Ezekiel saw them from the shed site, still half cleared of debris, and had his rifle in hand before they'd cleared the tree line. Winifred came out onto the porch behind him, didn't flinch at the sight of 3 armed strangers riding into the clearing, stood her ground beside him instead, arms folded, chin up. The lead rider reined in 20 feet out, a big man, going soft through the middle the way men do when their money does their hard work for them, wrapped in a coat that had cost more than most families in the territory saw in a year. Wren, he didn't dismount. Didn't figure you'd still be up here, this deep into winter. Man with sense would have come down before the pass sealed. This is my land, Ezekiel said. I don't answer to any man's calendar for how I choose to live on it. Your land. The rider's mouth curled, not quite a smile. Funny thing about that. County records tell a different story once you read them right. County records tell whatever a man pays them to say, when he's got the money and the patience to bend them. Winifred's voice cut clean, through the cold air, sharp as the wind itself. I've read every page of those records myself, Mr. Boyd, the rider said, eyes narrowing on her, with an expression that carried the particular flavor of contempt she'd spent her whole life learning to recognize before it fully formed. I work for Mr. Voss, and I'd advise you, ma'am, to leave the men's business to the men. I'd advise you, Winifred said, without missing a single beat, to tell Mr. Voss that the woman he's underestimating currently holds documentation proving his boundary claim rests on a creek crossing that didn't exist for 8 years after the date he's claiming it as historical fact, and that I intend to lay every scrap of it in front of a territorial judge the moment this pass opens wide enough for a horse to walk through it. The silence that followed had teeth in it. Boyd's eyes flickered, just slightly. The particular flicker of a man who'd expected an easy conversation and had just discovered it wasn't going to be one. "That's a bold claim for a woman who's never set foot in a courtroom," he said finally. "Bold claims are the only kind worth making," Winifred said. "I'll see you and your Mr. Voss there, come spring. Until then, I'd advise your men to stay off this land. We've already lost a shed and a well to whatever accident your employer arranged. I doubt a territorial judge will look kindly on a pattern of accidents following so closely behind a disputed claim." Boyd's jaw worked. He looked at Ezekiel, then back at Winifred, some calculation shifting behind his eyes. "Careful, ma'am," he said finally low. "Mountains this remote. All manner of accidents can happen to folks who don't have the sense to leave well enough alone." "I've survived worse than a mountain, Mr. Boyd," Winifred said, and her voice didn't waver, not even slightly. "I survived 31 years of people underestimating exactly how much I was capable of. I intend to survive this too." Boyd held her eyes a long moment, then wheeled his horse, without another word, the other two riders falling in behind him, and rode back down the trail the way they'd come, leaving nothing behind but hoofprints already beginning to fill with fresh snow. Ezekiel lowered the rifle slowly, looked over at Winifred, standing on the porch, with her chin still up, her breath coming fast and hard in the cold air, adrenaline only now beginning to show through the cracks in her composure. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever watched," he said, "or the most reckless. Can it be both? Despite everything, despite the burned shed and the poisoned well, and 3 armed men riding away, with a threat hanging in the frozen air behind them, Ezekiel felt something rise up in his chest that was, unmistakably, dangerously close to a laugh. "It can be both," he agreed. Winifred looked at him, and for the first time, since Boyd had ridden into the clearing, something in her face eased. "Good," she said, "because I don't intend to make a habit of being anything less than exactly that much." The real storm came 10 days later. It came the way the worst ones always came on that mountain. Slow at first, a gray line building along the northern ridge that any experienced hand would have read as trouble hours before it arrived. Ezekiel read it, knew it, told Winifred to bank the fire high and bring in extra wood before midday. What he didn't account for was the trap line. He'd set snares along the eastern ridge 3 weeks back, before the shed burned, before the well went bad, back when checking them had been a simple matter of routine rather than a calculated risk taken on land that Voss's men had made abundantly, violently clear they considered contested ground. He went out that morning to pull the last of them in, before the storm sealed the ridge for good. Told Winifred he'd be back inside 2 hours. He was wrong. The storm came in faster than the gray line had promised, the wind swinging hard out of the north and bringing visibility down to nothing inside of 20 minutes, snow driving sideways. So thick the world simply vanished, tree line and ridge line, and sky all dissolving into one blind, howling white. Ezekiel turned back the moment he felt the wind shift. Started down the ridge trail at a half run, boots slipping on rock already glazing, over with ice beneath the fresh snow, which was when his ankle caught in the gap between 2 granite slabs, hidden under 6 inches of fresh powder, and his whole leg twisted sideways. With a crack he felt more than heard, pain lancing white, and total up, through his hip. He went down hard, lay there a moment, snow already beginning to collect against his shoulder, and understood, with the same cold clarity he brought to every crisis, exactly how bad his situation had become. Broken. The leg was broken, below the knee, bad enough that putting weight on it sent black spots crawling across his vision. And he was 3 miles from the cabin, in a storm that had already swallowed the trail whole. With the temperature dropping fast enough that he could feel it now, a different kind of cold than he'd ever respected quite enough, working its way up through his coat. He tried to stand, failed, tried again, using a fallen branch as a crutch, and made it perhaps 40 yards before the pain and the cold and the blinding white conspired together to drop him to his knees. Because this was how it happened, he understood dimly, some distant clinical part of his mind still functioning even as the rest of him began to slow. This was exactly how men died on this mountain. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a slow accumulation of bad luck and worse weather, until a man simply stopped being able to make his body do what his will demanded of it, and sat down in the snow and didn't get back up. He thought of Winifred, thought of her waiting back at the cabin, watching the storm build, watching the clock, watching the door. Thought, with something that cut sharper than the cold, that he might never get the chance to tell her the thing he'd started to understand about himself somewhere in the last 2 months. That the flicker she'd caught on his face in the clearing back in October had been the last honest mistake he'd ever make about her. That everything since had been the slow, deliberate work of a man falling, without entirely meaning to, in love with a woman who refused, on principle, to make herself smaller for anyone. He might die 3 miles from telling her that. The thought made him angry enough to try standing one more time. Back at the cabin, Winifred watched the storm swallow the ridge line and felt something cold settle into her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. 2 hours. He'd said 2 hours. It had been 4. She stood at the window, watching snow drive sideways past the glass in sheets, so thick she couldn't see the shed's foundation stones, 30 feet from the door, and felt the old fear rise up in her. Not the fear of being unwanted. Not the fear of taking up too much room in a world that had already decided her shape before she walked in. A different fear. Sharper. Simpler. The fear of losing something she'd only just found. She pulled on her coat. Because she was not, whatever anyone had ever told her about what a woman her size was, and wasn't capable of, going to stand at a window and wait politely for a man to either come home or not. She saddled the gelding, with hands that shook, once, before she forced them steady. Loaded a lantern, though she doubted it would hold flame more than a few minutes in wind like this. Took rope. Took the small hatchet from beside the fire. Took every scrap of certainty she'd built across 31 years of proving, over and over, that her body was capable of things the world assumed it wasn't. Then she rode out into the storm. The wind hit her the moment she cleared the tree line, a physical wall of it, cold enough to steal the breath straight out of her chest. She bent low, over the gelding's neck, let the animal find its own footing on a trail she could no longer see, with her own eyes, and pushed forward, into white that had no beginning and no end. She called his name. The wind tore it away before it had traveled 10 feet. She called again anyway, and again, because stopping meant admitting the possibility that calling wouldn't matter, and she was not, could not, would not let herself believe that yet. An hour in, the gelding shied hard, nearly unseating her, and Winifred fought the animal back under control with numb hands and a grip that had gone past feeling into pure stubborn will. Then she saw it, a shape in the white, low, still, too still. She was off the horse before she'd fully processed the decision to dismount, wading through snow that reached past her knees, and found Ezekiel Wren half buried against a fallen log, lips gone blue at the edges, eyes fluttering when she dropped to her knees beside him and pulled his face up out of the snow. Ezekiel. Nothing. A groan. His eyes opened, slow, unfocused. Winifred. His voice was barely a whisper, wind torn and cracked. You shouldn't. Storm's too bad. You shouldn't have. I don't recall asking your permission, she said, and her voice shook only slightly, only at the very edges, as she worked her hands under his shoulders and hauled with everything she had. Get up. Now. You do not get to die 3 miles from your own house, Ezekiel Wren. I forbid it. Legs broke. I know. I felt it when I moved you. Get up anyway. Somehow, between her strength and his will and a stubbornness that ran identical in both of them, they got him upright, then onto the gelding, Winifred half lifting, half dragging his full weight up into the saddle with a raw physical effort that would leave her arms aching for a week after. She walked the whole 3 miles back, leading the horse, through snow that fought her every step, wind driving ice crystals hard enough into her face to draw blood along one cheekbone, and she did not stop, did not slow, did not let herself think, even once, about how far they still had to go. Halfway back, she saw the second set of tracks. Fresh, coming up from the eastern boundary. 3 riders, by the depth and spacing of the prints, moving in the same direction the storm was pushing them, toward the cabin. Boyd. It had to be Boyd, out in this weather for exactly one reason. To finish what the shed fire and the poisoned well had started. Winifred's jaw set. She led the horse off the main trail, cutting a harder path, through deeper snow, adding precious minutes to a journey that felt already impossibly long, because she was not walking straight into 3 armed men, with an injured man draped unconscious across her saddle, and no way to defend either of them. She reached the cabin an hour after full dark, half frozen, arms shaking, and found the 3 riders already there, waiting in the lee of the lean-to, out of the worst of the wind, clearly prepared to wait out the storm however long it took. Boyd stepped forward the moment he saw her emerge from the trees, leading a horse, with Ezekiel's still form slumped across it. "Well," he said, and there was something ugly in his voice now, something that had shed whatever thin civility he'd worn during their last conversation. "Looks like the mountain did our work for us. Get back." Winifred's voice came out rougher than she intended, exhaustion and cold, and fury all braided together, into something that didn't sound entirely like her own voice anymore. "This man needs a doctor, not an audience. This man," Boyd said, taking a step closer, "needs to sign over a boundary claim before he freezes solid enough that his signature won't matter anymore." Winifred stood her ground, between Boyd and the horse, between Boyd and Ezekiel, snow driving sideways around all of them, the lantern she'd carried long since guttered out, nothing left but starlight through breaking cloud, and the pale, terrible glow of snow reflecting what little light remained. "You will not touch him," she said, each word landing like a hammer strike, flat and final. "I have spent this entire winter documenting every single crime your employer has committed against this land and this man. The fence, the shed, the well, and now this. 3 men riding out in a killing storm to finish an injured man, while his wife carries him home alone." "You're not his wife. Not yet," Winifred said, and something in her chest cracked wide open even as she said it. Some truth she hadn't let herself fully name, until this exact moment, standing in the snow, exhausted past reason, defending a man she'd known for less than 3 months, with everything her body had left to give. "But I intend to be. And I intend to stand in front of a territorial judge as exactly that, testifying to everything Cyrus Voss has done to try and take what isn't his. Starting with tonight." Boyd's eyes narrowed. He looked past her, at Ezekiel's still form on the horse, at the exhausted, unbending fury in Winifred's stance, and something in his calculation shifted. Because there was a difference, she understood even, through her exhaustion, between threatening an isolated man and threatening a woman who had just proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that she was neither isolated nor easily broken. "This isn't finished," Boyd said finally, backing toward his horse. "No," Winifred agreed. "It isn't. But it will be, come spring, in a courtroom, where I intend to bury your employer under every ounce of documentation I've spent this whole winter gathering." The 3 riders mounted, rode off into the dark, back toward the eastern boundary, leaving Winifred alone in the storm, with an unconscious man and a horse, and a cabin still 50 yards distant. She got him inside somehow. Never fully remembered the details of it afterward. Only the raw burn in her shoulders, and the terror underneath everything else, the fear that she'd find, once she got him under lamplight, that she'd already lost him to the cold. She hadn't. Ezekiel's eyes fluttered open as she splinted his leg by firelight, hands moving with a steadiness she didn't feel, and found her face above him in the warm gold light. "You came for me," he said. Voice cracked, barely more than breath. "Of course I came for you." Her own voice broke, finally, all the fear she'd held back, through the whole long ride catching up with her at once. "Did you truly think I'd sit by that window and wait politely to find out whether you lived or died?" "No," he said. "I don't suppose I did." "Good." She finished the splint, sat back on her heels, exhaustion crashing over her all at once. "Because you were wrong about one thing tonight, Ezekiel Wren." "What's that?" "I am not too much for anyone," she said, and her voice, though rough with cold and fear and spent adrenaline, carried something entirely new underneath it. Certainty. Absolute and unshakable. I am exactly enough. For this mountain. For that storm. For Cyrus Voss, and every man like him who's ever underestimated what I'm capable of. Ezekiel reached up, slow, and touched her cheek, where the ice had cut it earlier, blood long since frozen, and cleaned away. I already knew that, he said. I think I knew it the first hour you were here. They stayed there a long moment, firelight moving over both their faces, the storm still howling outside, but somehow smaller now, somehow survivable, now that the worst of it had already been walked through and won. Marry me, Ezekiel said. Quiet. Certain. Winifred went very still. Now? You've got a broken leg, and half the county trying to kill us both. Now, he said. Especially now? I nearly died 3 miles from telling you something tonight, Winifred, and I've had entirely enough of putting off honest things for a more convenient hour. That might never come. What were you going to tell me? He held her eyes, didn't flinch, didn't look away, the way he'd nearly done in the clearing back in October, before he'd learned that looking away from her cost more than it ever saved. That I love you, he said. That I've loved you since somewhere around the 2nd week, watching you go through my father's papers by lamplight, refusing to let anyone take this land or this life without a fight. That I would rather freeze to death on that ridge knowing you knew it than survive 100 more winters and never say it. Winifred's eyes filled. She didn't let the tears fall, but she let him see them, which cost her something. She understood, something she'd spent 31 years learning never to let anyone witness. I love you too, she said. I think I've known it since the barn burned, watching you fight. That fire like losing it was losing a piece of yourself, and understanding I wanted to stand beside you fighting it regardless of what it cost either of us. Is that a yes? That, Winifred said, is absolutely a yes. They married 3 days later, on the cabin porch, the moment the storm had finally broken into a hard, bright, blinding calm, and Ezekiel could stand, unsteady on a crutch he'd carved himself the night before out of sheer stubborn refusal to be married sitting down. There was no minister, no witnesses beyond the mountains themselves, white and vast and indifferent, and the 2 horses watching from the lean-to with mild curiosity. I don't know the proper words for this, Ezekiel said, standing braced on his crutch, snow glittering gold in the thin winter sun. Then we'll make our own, Winifred said. She took his hands. Hers still bore the marks of the ride, small cuts healing along her knuckles, and his were rough, with cold and splinted wrong at one finger, where he'd broken it bracing his fall. I promised to stay, she said. To fight beside you, not behind you. To never make myself smaller for anyone's comfort, including yours, and to never ask you to make yourself smaller for mine. I promised to see you, Ezekiel said. Completely. Without the flicker, without the half-second of doubt, that cost me nearly everything the day you rode out of those trees. I promised to spend every day, after this one making up for that half-second, for as long as you'll let me. That, Winifred said, voice thick, is more than good enough. They stood there in the cold, in the bright hard light, 2 people who had each spent 31 years being told, in 1,000 different rooms, that they took up too much space in the world. And neither one of them, standing on that porch, with the mountains stretching white and silent in every direction, felt anything close to too much. They felt, for the first time either of them could remember, exactly right. Somewhere 3 ridges distant, in a warm office in Helena, that smelled of cigar smoke and old money, Cyrus Voss read Boyd's report of the failed confrontation, with a stillness that unsettled every man in the room with him. Then he set the report down, folded his hands. The woman, he said slowly, handles the books. That's what Boyd says, sir. Then find me anything there is to find on the Danforth shipping matter, Voss said. The firm she kept books for. I understand there was an unpleasant end to her employment there. I intend to know exactly how unpleasant and exactly how useful before this reaches a courtroom. He turned to the window, looked out at the mountains rising blue-gray in the distance. Somewhere beyond them a cabin, and a marriage, and a stubborn woman, with a mind too sharp for anyone's comfort. Everyone has a weakness, Voss said quiet. even the ones who've spent their whole lives learning how to hide it. Outside, the first true spring wind was beginning, somewhere far below the snow line, to stir. Spring came to that mountain the way it always came, reluctant, grudging, as if the winter itself resented giving up its grip one single degree at a time. But it came. By the second week of April, the snowpack along the southern slope had begun its long collapse into meltwater, filling the creek beds until they ran loud and fast and the color of weak tea, carrying half a winter's worth of silt down toward the valley floor. Ezekiel's leg had healed crooked at the shin, a permanent reminder etched into bone, though he'd stopped needing the crutch by March and refused, flatly, to let it slow him past that point. Winifred watched him limp out to check the fence line, that first real morning of thaw, and felt something in her chest that she still, for months into a marriage neither of them had planned on surviving to see spring, hadn't found adequate words for. Because that was the thing nobody warned you about love arriving late in a hard life. It didn't soften the hard parts. It just gave you someone standing beside you while you carried them. She turned back to the table. Because there was work to do. Real work. The kind that would decide whether this whole winter's survival had been worth anything at all, or whether Cyrus Voss would simply wait them out one legal maneuver at a time, until they had nothing left to fight with. The documents were spread across the table in the same careful rows she'd kept them in since December. Boundary filings, survey marks, her own painstaking notes in the margins, cross-referenced 3 times, over against every county record Amos had managed to smuggle up the mountain before the pass sealed for good. It was solid work. She knew that. Knew it the way she'd known, 6 years running in, that Helena office, exactly which ledger entry hid a lie, before the owner's own son had finished explaining it away. But solid wasn't the same as sufficient. Because a territorial judge, she understood with the particular clarity of a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated in rooms full of confident men, would not simply take her word for any of it. Not from a bookkeeper, not from a woman, not from someone whose only credential was 3 shelves of careful handwriting and a stubborn refusal to be wrong. She needed a witness. Someone who had seen, firsthand, the moment Cyrus Voss decided to manufacture a claim rather than accept the truth already written in 40 years of undisturbed county record. She didn't have one. Not yet. The letter arrived on the same run that brought news the pass had finally opened enough for a careful horse and a careful rider. Amos delivered it along, with everything else, mail sacks bulging, after 5 months of accumulated correspondence, and Winifred nearly missed it entirely among the stack of seed catalogs and Thomas's usual worried pages from California. Except the return address stopped her cold. Odette Vance. Bozeman. She knew that name. Ezekiel had spoken it exactly once, back in October, in the careful, flat voice he used for things that still cost him something to say out loud. The first bride. The only one, whose name he'd never once let himself forget. Winifred opened the letter, with hands that had gone very still. Mrs. Wren, you do not know me, though I imagine you have heard my name, and I imagine it has not been spoken kindly, because I did not leave your husband under kind circumstances. I am writing you now, because I believe I possess information relevant to a dispute you are presently engaged in, and because I have spent the better part of 5 months attempting to decide whether cowardice or conscience will win the argument I have been having with myself. I currently keep the books for Voss Freight and Transport in their Bozeman office. I took the position some time ago, needing steady work, and I did not know, when I accepted it, that Mr. Voss's business dealings would ever intersect with a man I once left standing alone in a snowstorm. I know now. I have seen the correspondence, Mrs. Wren. I have seen the instructions Mr. Voss gave his surveyor 3 years before the letter he sent your husband, requesting a boundary reading that would place the county marker at the 3rd creek crossing rather than the 2nd. I have seen the date on that request. It predates any genuine confusion about historical boundaries by nearly 3 years. Mr. Voss did not discover an irregularity in your father-in-law's filing. He manufactured one, deliberately, with the patience of a man willing to wait years for a debt to come due. I have also seen, more recently, an inquiry he sent to Helena regarding your own former employer. I do not know what he hopes to find there. I only know he is looking, and that a man who looks that hard usually means to use whatever he finds. I do not know what use any of this is to you now, this late in the season, this far removed from the courtroom where such things get decided. But I could not, in good conscience, continue keeping his books while knowing what those books concealed, and while knowing that the man I once abandoned to 5 failed marriages might be standing to lose everything he built afterward, to a lie I helped file paperwork for, without understanding, at the time, exactly what I was filing. If you require a witness, I am prepared to be one, regardless of what it costs me. Sincerely, Odette Vance. Winifred read it twice. Then she carried it out to where Ezekiel was mending fence, wire cutters in hand, and washed his face, while he read it a third time, slower, the same way he'd read Voss's original letter back in October, when the world had still been simple enough to hope his father's paperwork might hold on its own. Odette, he said finally. Quiet. You remember her clearly. I never once forgot her. His jaw tightened. She was the first. She's the one I judged the rest by, for longer than I should have. Do you trust what she's written? Ezekiel looked out at the mountains, blue and hazy in the spring thaw, snowmelt roaring somewhere down the ridge in a rhythm that had become, over the winter, as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. I trust that a woman doesn't write a letter like that unless something in her has been eating at her for a long while, he said finally. Whether we can trust her enough to build a legal case on her word alone, that's a different question. Then we go to Bozeman, Winifred said, and we find out. They rode out 4 days later, leaving the cabin and the fence and the half-mended spring work behind in favor of a 2-day journey down out of the high country into a town Winifred had never once set foot in, carrying with them every scrap of documentation 5 months of careful winter work had produced. Bozeman was larger than Helena, louder, busier, full of the particular chaos of a territory still deciding what kind of place it intended to become. They found Odette Vance's rooming house on the second afternoon, a narrow building 3 streets back from the main thoroughfare, and Winifred watched Ezekiel's shoulders go rigid the moment the door opened. Because there she was. The first bride, older now than she'd been in his memory, her face carrying 5 years of hard living instead of the frightened, tearful girl he'd watched climb back into a wagon bound for Helena. Ezekiel, Odette said. Her voice caught, just slightly. I wasn't certain you'd come. You gave me a reason to. Odette's gaze moved to Winifred, standing beside him, and something complicated crossed her face. Not the flicker Winifred had spent her whole life learning to recognize. Something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or something closer to relief. You must be his wife. Winifred. I'm glad. Odette said it simply, without ceremony. I've thought about him often, these 5 years. Wondered whether he found someone who could stand what I couldn't. The isolation, Ezekiel said. Flat. No. Odette shook her head, slow, careful. I could have learned the isolation in time. What I couldn't stand was the silence I mistook for coldness when I was too young and too frightened to understand it was only ever quiet, not cruelty. Her eyes went distant a moment. I've had 5 years to understand the difference. I only wish I'd understood it sooner. For your sake as much as mine. The apology, when it finally came fully into the room, wasn't the point of their visit. But Winifred watched something ease in Ezekiel's shoulders regardless, some old wound he'd carried longer than he'd ever admitted, finally allowed to close over. They spent 3 hours at Odette's small kitchen table going through everything she'd brought. Copies of correspondence, painstakingly transcribed by hand, since she hadn't dared remove the originals from Voss's office without raising suspicion. Dates, names, a clear, unbroken chain of evidence stretching back 3 years, proving beyond any reasonable argument that Cyrus Voss had known, from the very first letter he'd sent to that surveyor, exactly what he was manufacturing. This is enough, Winifred said finally, sitting back from the table, something fierce and satisfied moving through her chest for the first time in months. This is more than enough. There's a territorial court session scheduled in Helena, Odette said. 3 weeks from now, Judge Ambrose Tate presides. He's fair, by most accounts, though not a man who suffers weak evidence gladly. We don't have weak evidence, Winifred said. Not anymore. Odette looked at her a long moment. something searching in her expression. "You intend to argue the case yourself?" she said. Not quite a question. "I do." A woman, arguing land law, before a territorial judge. Odette's mouth curved, not unkindly. "You understand what you'll be walking into." "I understand it exactly," Winifred said, and her chin came up, that same half-inch it always came up, the gesture Ezekiel had learned, over the winter, to recognize as the surest sign that a fight was about to be won regardless of what stood in its way. "I spent 6 years being the smartest person in a room full of men who refused to see it because of my size. I do not intend to let a courtroom be any different." Odette's expression shifted, something like admiration breaking through the careful reserve she'd carried since opening her door. "Then I'll testify," she said, "whatever it costs me with Voss. I owe this mountain and this man a debt 5 years overdue." They returned to the cabin, with 3 weeks left before the court session, and those 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation that left Winifred's hands cramped, from writing and her voice hoarse, from rehearsing arguments out loud to an audience of exactly one deeply attentive husband and 2 profoundly uninterested horses. Ezekiel watched her work with something that had, somewhere over the winter, stopped being simple admiration and become something closer to awe. Because this was who she was, he understood now, fully, in a way the flicker of that first afternoon had never once allowed him to see clearly. Not a woman who needed protecting from a hard world. A woman who had spent her whole life sharpening herself against that hardness until she'd become something the world had never quite figured out how to blunt. "You're ready," he said, the night before they were due to ride for Helena. "I don't feel ready." "You never will. Readiness isn't a feeling, Winifred. It's a decision you make, and then prove true afterward." He reached across the table, took her hand. "I've watched you prove harder things true than a courtroom argument. I have no doubt left in me about how this ends." Winifred looked at him a long moment. At the man, who had once let a half-second flicker of doubt cross his face in a clearing full of snow, and had spent every day, since making up for it, exactly as he'd promised on their wedding morning. "I love you," she said. Simple. Direct. "I know." He almost smiled. "You've been telling me all winter in 100 different ways that had nothing to do with the words themselves." They rode for Helena at first light. The territorial courtroom sat in a squat brick building 3 blocks off the main street, and it was already crowded by the time Winifred, Ezekiel, and Odette Vance climbed the front steps together, word of the dispute having traveled the particular gossip channels of a small territorial capital in the way such things always did. Formal law licenses were a scarce thing in that stretch of the territory, and Judge Tate had long since developed a practical tolerance for it, provided the person addressing his court could back up every word with paper. Ezekiel had signed a brief document that morning naming Winifred his representative of record for the proceeding, a courtesy the clerk accepted without argument, mostly because there was no other attorney within 2 days' ride willing to take the case on such short notice. That, and nothing else, was what let her stand. Cyrus Voss was already seated at the opposing table when they entered. A big man gone soft, through the middle exactly, as Boyd had described him, dressed in a coat that had clearly cost more than most families in the territory saw in a year, flanked by 2 lawyers, whose confidence Winifred recognized immediately as the particular brand worn by men who had never once lost an argument to someone they'd already decided not to take seriously. Voss's eyes moved, over her, slow, assessing, and something in his expression made Winifred's spine straighten, before she'd even consciously decided to straighten it. "Mrs. Wren," he said, not quite standing, the courtesy calculated to land exactly at the edge of insult. "I confess I expected your husband's lawyer, not his wife. I am his representative of record, in every sense that matters this morning," Winifred said, and her voice carried clean and steady across the courtroom, drawing more than one curious glance from the gallery. "I've spent 5 months preparing this case. I intend to argue it myself." Something flickered across Voss's face. Not quite the same flicker Ezekiel had once let slip in a snowy clearing. Something colder. Calculation, recognizing an opponent it hadn't fully accounted for. "How novel," he said. "We'll see how novel you find it in an hour," Winifred said, and took her seat. Judge Ambrose Tate entered 10 minutes later, a lean, gray, bearded man, with the particular weary patience of someone who had presided over more territorial land disputes than he cared to remember, and called the proceedings to order with a single sharp rap of his gavel. Voss's lawyers went first. Smooth. Practiced. They laid out the boundary claim, with the easy confidence of men who had done this exact maneuver in a dozen other courtrooms, citing survey markers and modern deed language, painting Ezekiel's father as a well-meaning but careless man whose original filing had simply, honestly, contained an error that 4 decades of undisturbed possession did not erase. Judge Tate listened without expression, made notes, asked 2 clarifying questions that gave nothing away about which direction his thinking leaned. Then it was Winifred's turn. She stood, felt every eye in the courtroom shift toward her, felt the particular weight of being a woman standing, where women did not typically stand, arguing what women were not typically permitted to argue. She let the silence hold a beat longer than was comfortable. Then she began. Your Honor, opposing counsel has described an honest error, discovered through diligent modern survey work. I intend to demonstrate, using Mr. Voss's own correspondence, that no honest error exists in this matter. Only a deliberate, patient, 3-year campaign to manufacture one. She laid out the timeline. Methodical, unhurried, document after document, each one building on the last, walking the courtroom, through the same careful chain of reasoning she'd spent all winter constructing by lamplight. The creek crossing that hadn't existed at the time the original filing was made. Ezekiel's father's own journal, describing the flood that had shifted the waterway's course years after the boundary had already been legally established. The survey request Voss had commissioned 3 full years before ever contacting Ezekiel, specifying, in his own hand, exactly the boundary reading he wished the surveyor to produce. This is not the record of a man who discovered an accident, Winifred said, her voice steady, carrying clean across a courtroom that had gone very quiet. This is the record of a man who purchased the outcome he wanted 3 years in advance, and then waited, patiently, for the paperwork to look old enough to be believed. Voss's lawyer rose, objecting, but Judge Tate waved him down, with a single sharp motion, his attention entirely fixed on the documents Winifred had spread across the table before him. You have a witness to this correspondence? The judge asked. Beyond the documents themselves? Winifred turned. I do, Your Honor. I call Miss Odette Vance. Odette rose from the gallery, walked forward with a steadiness that Winifred understood, watching her, had cost the other woman a great deal to summon. She testified for 20 minutes. Clear, precise, describing, in exact detail, the correspondence she had transcribed by hand rather than remove from Voss's office, the dates, the instructions Voss had given his surveyor, the moment, 18 months into her employment, that she had understood exactly what she was helping to conceal. Why come forward now? Voss's lawyer asked, on cross-examination, his tone carrying the particular condescension of a man certain he'd found the weak point in an otherwise solid case. You worked for Mr. Voss. You benefited from his employment. What changed? Odette held his eyes without flinching. I once left a good man standing alone on a mountain, she said, because I was too frightened to stand beside him through something hard. I have spent 5 years regretting that cowardice. I did not intend to compound it by staying silent, while my former employer destroyed the very life that man managed to build without me. The courtroom was utterly silent when she finished. Voss's second lawyer rose then, papers in hand, and turned toward Winifred with the particular confidence of a man who believed he'd saved his best card for last. Mrs. Wren, isn't it true you were dismissed from your previous employment at Danforth Shipping in Helena? Terminated, in fact, under circumstances your former employer was unwilling to fully explain? Winifred didn't flinch. She'd expected this. Odette had warned her, in a hurried note 3 weeks back, that Voss's men had been asking questions in Helena of anyone who'd once worked at Danforth, hoping to find some old scandal to hang around her neck before she ever reached this courtroom. I was dismissed, Winifred said, the week after I discovered the owner's own son had been embezzling from company accounts for the better part of 2 years. Mr. Danforth chose to protect his son's reputation rather than mine. I have the ledgers I compiled proving the embezzlement, should the court wish to review them, along with a letter from Mr. Danforth's head clerk confirming the circumstances of my departure. She held the judge's eyes steady. I would be glad to discuss my employment history at any length Your Honor finds useful. I have never once needed to hide from it. Voss's lawyer's confidence faltered, visibly, and he glanced back toward his client for some direction. That did not come. Judge Tate made a note, unhurried, and did not look up. Your Honor, Winifred added, into the silence that followed, I would only observe that a man who spends 5 months digging through another woman's employment history, hoping to find something to discredit her with, is rarely a man confident in the strength of his own claim. A ripple of something moved through the gallery. Not quite laughter. Close enough to it. Judge Tate made a final note. Set down his pen. Mr. Voss, he said, and his voice had gone flat. Final, the particular tone of a man who had already made up his mind and was merely observing the formality of announcing it aloud. I have presided over a great many boundary disputes in this territory. I have rarely seen one so thoroughly and so patiently documented, as fraudulent as the one your own correspondence has just proven itself to be. Voss's face had gone the color of old ash. Your Honor, the original filing stands, Judge Tate said, cutting him off with a single sharp motion of his hand. The boundary remains exactly where Ezekiel Wren's father recorded it in 1832. Mr. Wren's title to the disputed land is confirmed, in full, effective immediately. He paused, looking down at Voss, with an expression that carried something close to disgust. And I am forwarding a full transcript of this proceeding to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office, along with every document entered, as evidence today. Fraud committed against a federal land filing is not a matter this court is inclined to let end with a mere loss of claim. The gavel came down. Winifred sat very still for a long moment, the sound of it echoing through her chest, before Ezekiel's hand found hers under the table and squeezed once, hard, and she finally let herself breathe. Outside, on the courthouse steps, spring sunlight fell warm and gold across a crowd of onlookers who had gathered, drawn by whatever version of the story had already begun spreading through Helena's streets before the proceedings had even finished. Cyrus Voss emerged behind them, flanked by his silent lawyers, his face still carrying the particular gray pallor of a man watching years of careful patient planning collapse in a single morning. He stopped, briefly, in front of Winifred. You understand, he said, low, that I will appeal this. You may, Winifred said, but you'll be appealing against a woman who has spent her entire life being told she was too much for any room she walked into. I promise you, Mr. Voss, I have considerably more patience for a fight than you have money to fund one. Something in Voss's face shifted, some final recognition settling in, and he turned, without another word, and walked down the courthouse steps into whatever remained of his diminished future. Boyd was waiting at the bottom of the steps, watched his employer pass, then looked up, found Winifred's eyes, and did something she hadn't expected. He nodded. Small, grudging, but unmistakable respect, offered from a man who had once told her, in a howling storm, to leave the men's business to the men. Odette found them a few minutes later, standing slightly apart from the dispersing crowd, her expression carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had just set down a weight she'd been carrying for a very long time. I've resigned my position with Voss Freight, effective this morning, she said. I don't imagine I'll find it difficult, given today's proceedings. You'd be welcome, Ezekiel said, should you ever want honest work on honest ground. My wife could use a second set of capable hands, come planting season. Something in Odette's face softened, gratitude and old grief moving together across her features. I think I'd like that, she said, if you'll both have me. Winifred looked at the woman, who had once been the first to flee this exact mountain, standing now on a courthouse step having just helped save everything Ezekiel had built since, and felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the legal victory and everything to do with the strange, unexpected shape forgiveness sometimes took. We'll have you, she said. Gladly. They rode back up the mountain 3 days later, the pass fully open now, wildflowers already beginning to push up through the last patches of stubborn snow along the lower slopes. The cabin looked smaller when they finally rode into the clearing. The way home always looks smaller after you've been somewhere large and loud and full of strangers deciding your future. Smaller and entirely, completely enough. We did it, Winifred said, looking out at the land. Their land. Confirmed now, finally, beyond any further argument. You did it, Ezekiel said. I just stood beside you while you did. That's not nothing. She turned to look at him. That's everything, actually. Standing beside someone instead of ahead of them or behind them. I intend to spend the rest of my life doing exactly that, he said. If you'll let me. Winifred smiled, the particular smile that had become, over one long winter, entirely his to witness. I intend to hold you to it, she said. The years that followed were not soft ones. Nothing on that mountain was ever soft, not truly, not even in the gentlest summer. But they were honest years, built the way Ezekiel had first built his cabin, board by board, promise by promise, two people who had each learned young that the world would try to shrink them, and had each, separately, and then together, refused. They never had children. It was a grief they carried quietly, in the particular way people carry griefs that have no dramatic shape to them, just a steady absence woven through otherwise full lives. But the land itself grew, year over year, until the small cabin Ezekiel had built for a solitary life became the anchor of something considerably larger. Odette stayed on, that first summer, and never quite left again. Kept the ledgers for the growing operation, with the same sharp precision Winifred had once brought to a Helena shipping office, the two women working side by side. Through long afternoons, an old wound between them healed into something like genuine friendship. The trap lines gave way, over the following years, to proper grazing land. The single lean-to became a working barn, then two barns, then a spread, that stretched across boundaries no one ever again dared to dispute, the territorial court's ruling standing unchallenged for the remainder of both their lives. By 1889, when Montana finally shed its territorial status and became a state in full, the ranch had grown into one of the most respected operations in the county, known as much for the fairness of its dealings as for the quality of its stock, a reputation built, deliberately, by two people who had each spent their younger years being dealt with unfairly and had decided, together, never to run their own affairs that way. In the spring of 1890, 17 years after a woman had ridden alone through a killing storm to carry an injured man home, an older woman came through on the stage from Helena, asking after the Wren Ranch, and found, when she finally arrived at the gate, a spread of land that bore almost no resemblance to the isolated cabin she remembered from decades past. She was shown up to the main house by a young ranch hand, who had no idea, yet, that the woman asking so many careful questions was Winifred's own sister, Constance, arriving unannounced after 17 years of careful, guilty silence. Winifred met her on the porch. Both of them streaked now, with the first real gray, the particular kind, that comes to people who have lived hard, honest lives and made their peace with the cost of it. Constance stood at the base of the steps a long moment, looking up at a sister she had once relegated to trays sent upstairs, now standing on the porch of a ranch that employed dozens of hands and supplied cattle to half the county. I heard about the ranch, Constance said finally. I didn't believe it was truly yours. I thought perhaps there'd been some mistake in the telling. There was no mistake, Winifred said. Just 17 years of work you weren't present to witness. Something in Constance's face crumpled, old shame surfacing after years of practiced denial. I was cruel to you, she said. I told myself, for years, it wasn't cruelty, that I was only being honest about how the world would treat you. But I think now I was simply afraid the world would treat me the same way if I stood too close to you, and I let that fear make me small in exactly the way I always accused you of being. Winifred was quiet a long moment, watching her sister stand at the base of the steps with an honesty that had taken her far too many years to summon. I forgive you, Winifred said finally. Simple, not soft, exactly, but true. Not because you've earned it in a single afternoon, but because I've learned, on this mountain, that holding a grudge takes up exactly the kind of space I refuse to waste on anything that doesn't feed me anymore. Constance climbed the steps, slow, and the two sisters stood together on a porch built by a man who had once believed himself too much for any woman to love, embracing for the first time in longer than either of them could clearly remember. Ezekiel watched from the doorway, silent, granting them the privacy the moment deserved. That evening, once Constance had been shown to a guest room in a house that had, over 17 years, grown considerably larger than either of them had ever planned for. Winifred stood beside Ezekiel on the same porch, where they'd married on a broken leg and a borrowed crutch. Below them, the ranch stretched out into the gathering dusk, cattle moving slow and dark against the last gold light on the ridgeline. 17 years of careful work made visible in a single sweeping view neither of them had ever taken for granted. "We built something true," Winifred said. "That's rarer than people understand, I think. Rarer than love itself, sometimes." "True," Ezekiel agreed, "and large enough to hold both of us, exactly as we were. Mountains didn't ask you to be small. They only asked you to be strong enough to stay. And they had stayed. Through storm and fire, and a courtroom battle neither of them could have won alone. Through every hard winter and every fragile spring, two people who the world had once decided were too much, building, together, a life large enough to prove the world entirely, gloriously wrong."